Good afternoon. I'm James Brooks, and I'm here with Marshall Terry, E.A. Lilly Professor of English, to continue our conversation that we began on the first two tapes in this series. Those conversations were in the form of interviews and covered the decade of the 50s and the decade of the 60s. Today's conversation, however, will be in the form of a dialogue and will deal mostly with the decade of the 70s. However, before we get into the 70s, we wanted to clean up a few details from the previous two decades, particularly having to do with the Tate years and the physical development of the campus, especially new buildings and buildings that were remodeled or renovated in a major way. And Marsh, I added up at least 31 buildings that
I didn't realize that. That's amazing.
It really is, but it includes everything from the renovation of Dallas Hall to doubling the size of Perkins Administration Building, building Moody Coliseum, which enabled the conversion of the old gymnasium into a swimming pool, and on and on and on. The entire freshman quad was built during that time.
Yeah.
And the upper class quad was completed during those years. The medical center was built. Heroy Hall was built, the Underwood Law Library, the Science Information Center. And when you think about it, one of the most interesting little detours in this is the attempts to depart from the standard Georgian architecture.
Yes.
I think this probably first happened with the Science Information Center, didn't it?
I think so. Who designed that?
That was an O'Neill Ford building.
Yes, I think so.
And
they tried to do, they did do something a little different.
They did. Only has one window in it. But then when the art school complex, the 6 buildings that comprised the original art school were built, that's a slight departure from Georgian too. And the one that I knew the most about was the construction of Heroy Hall, in which some of us who were involved in the planning of it were advocating a contemporary building to kind of express philosophically the fact that we were avant-garde academics and all. And Bill Clements was the chairman of the Board of Governors at that time. And I will never forget a conversation with Bill Heroy Sr., the benefactor, Bill Clements, Fred Wendorf and me, and Wendorf and I were talking about a contemporary building, and Clements kind of settled into his seat and he said, well, that's just fine. You just go find yourself another university to build it at. And
that doesn't sound like Bill at all.
That sort of focused the discussion. So I think, we concentrated appropriately in our previous conversations about all of the many contributions that Willis made in structuring the real university, the people and the programs. But there was this side of it too that I think needs to be noted.
Because Willis kept saying we're not going to concentrate on bricks and mortar. And they did. I remember when Dallas Hall was renovated, the English department moved to the library. And one thing that happened was all the archives, the notes of the faculty meetings of the English department came up missing, were somehow taken out with the trash, which was a great loss if you think how many dissertations that might have been about all those characters in the English department. And then I was chair of English, and so after the renovation of Dallas Hall, moved into the second floor, this wonderful, huge, strangely proportioned office with a red carpet. And Willis came over, and he looked at me, and he looked at it, and said, well, the strangest shaped person in the university has the strangest shaped office. Which I appreciated a good deal.
Well, it was kind of interesting in the redo of Dallas Hall. That building was the first building of the university, of course, and And President Heyer, a physicist, really had an inherent distrust of other disciplines like architecture. And so he took the specifications and went through and redoubled the thickness of all the walls in Dallas Hall so it would last forever. And when we came to remodel it, it cost 10 times as much to remodel it as it did to build it, because of in no small part because of those thick walls and getting all of the air conditioning ducts in and all of that.
Yeah.
It was a major project.
Well, they cleaned that beautiful oculus. Is that what it's called?
The dome.
Yeah, in the dome.
Right.
And took out one stairwell to make room for an elevator. Lowered the ceilings.
Right.
Changed the building quite a bit, actually.
Changed the buildings quite a lot, but preserved the rotunda and preserved the McCord Theater,
Yes.
which was an important part. It was no longer the Arden Playhouse as it had been originally.
Well, it's a beautiful building, and I still, when I go in it every day, think of it as kind of the temple where I go to work.
Well, it is a classical temple in a very real sense.
Certainly been my psychic home.
Well, I always felt that, have always felt that my favorite office of all of the offices I've occupied in a half a dozen buildings over the years, the one I liked best was the one off the rotunda in Dallas Hall. That was a very, very nice place to be, sort of the spiritual center of the university.
They're still jockeying around in those offices right as we sit here.
Probably so. That's the nature of academic offices.
So how important offices are.
Well, you know, the Tate years, even in spite of all of the activities, both the intellectual and cultural and physical activities that were going on in the buildings and so on, was really a period of, in hindsight, a period of relative stability in the university. I mean, here was a steady hand taking over from an earlier steady hand in the person of Humphrey Lee. And so we got to the early 70s, and Willis was leaving, and we covered already in a previous conversation the search for his successor and the appearance of Paul Hardin on the scene. I don't think any of us had any way of anticipating what a turbulent decade was going to follow.
No, we didn't. And Paul Hardin seemed like such a beautiful choice.
Yes.
And a fit in the chancellor-president relationship.
That's certainly true. And when Paul came, he came from having been a law professor at Duke and then president of Wofford College, a small Methodist college in South Carolina. And he plunged into a small but nonetheless major university with a lot more complexities in a city that was totally different than Spartanburg, South Carolina, where Wofford was, and with a board that was much more inclined to want to intervene directly in the administrative affairs of the institution. And I think, and inevitably we will talk about the reasons that may have surrounded Paul's departure, but clearly he came here, and clearly in my view, he came here with maybe a little less than a full appreciation of what he was getting into.
Well, he had such enthusiasm, and he had a sense of self-worth, and that he would be successful. He was a golden boy.
That's right.
And I thought he was wonderful. Of course, I was on that search committee, and but he came in with such a positive attitude, and then he was a hands-on guy. From being president of a small college, he used those same techniques. He'd write you notes, he'd call you up, he'd always encourage you. He was good to work with, but he had the requisite ego of a college president, I think.
And people who haven't been as close to presidents as you and I have don't realize sometimes how important ego is. You're not going to make it very long as a president if you don't have a pretty strong ego. Paul, you know, you're talking about being the golden boy. I will never forget the afternoon that Paul had his fateful conference with Ed Cox, chairman of the Board of Governors, and C.A. Tatum, chairman of the Board of Trustees, who came to his office to express dissatisfaction with his performance. And Paul impulsively resigned on the spot and called me at home and asked if he and Barbara, his wife, could come over and visit. And they spent about 2 hours in our home that evening. And among many other things, Paul said, well, you know, this is the first thing that I've ever touched that has not turned to gold. He just didn't think he could fail. And I think that if he had been here longer, and perhaps if Bill Clements, who was the chairman of the board, who had really sought him out and hired him, if Bill had not gone to Washington, that might have been different.
Mm-hmm. And they never did say why this happened. And he did impulsively resign. So it set up a year of confrontation between the faculty and Ed Cox particularly and the trustees. We got a little ahead of ourselves because he named you provost.
He did, and that was in his first fall. Neil McFarland had, during Paul's interview, Neil had indicated before Paul even accepted the job that he, Neil, planned to step down as soon as it was convenient for Paul if he came as president. And that occurred about midway through the fall semester, the 72 fall. Paul confronted a number of things, but he was, because we had just come out of all of the decade of unrest nationally in college campuses, particularly the last 4 or 5 years with the Vietnam War and all. There was unrest on this campus, not nearly as severe as on others, but Paul came with the idea that his entire focus should be on the events on the SMU campus, and rather than the board or the community as his first concern. And
whereas Willis had never missed a meeting downtown.
That's right. Willis.
Various groups, civic groups.
And so Paul did not have the currency in the bank, so to speak, that Willis had. Willis was a master at having enough support bases between the board and the community and the church and the faculty that if he got in trouble in one place, he had a couple of bases to fall back on. Yeah. And Paul had not yet built that. He encountered a number of things that led probably to the ultimate dissatisfaction or concern, at least, that the trustees expressed. One of the things that happened early on was at the end of the football season in '72, when Hayden Fry was terminated as coach, and it actually is a fact that people think that was because of Hayden's won-loss record. Actually, he was well above 50% wins.
Yeah, I think he had a 6-5 record the year that he was let go.
That's right, he did. But he...
think of how glorious that would be now.
That's right. Hayden always sort of viewed, he was also athletic director, as you remember. And he had a sort of a feeling that budgets were some kind of expressions of fantasy to be enjoyed and looked at and put away and forgotten. And he really had a major problem in financial management, and that was the thing that, more than his won-loss record, that did him in.
Hayden was a character. I remember when he arrived, we went to hear him speak, and he got up and said, "I am the oratorical equivalent of a blocked punt." And he was. He was.
Well, he was.
He went on from SMU, you know.
Oh, yes.
And just was dominant in Iowa.
That's right. Went briefly to North Texas and then to the University of Iowa and was there for at least 20, maybe 25 years. Very successful career. A few Rose Bowls and Big Ten championships.
Controlled all the concessions.
That's right. Sold all the T-shirts.
Right.
Well, there was
he learned something about budget.
Well, there was another problem that came up, and this was a piece of the puzzle, not the puzzle, but a piece of the problem. There was an assistant coach whose name I don't remember, but a player and his father came in to see Paul and said, you know, Coach so-and-so, referring to that assistant, is paying $5 a tackle for hits, which of course is not accepted by the NCAA. Paul being Paul, he picks up the phone and calls Kansas City and turns us in without letting the board know or anything, and they found out about it after the fact, and that was an unfortunate error, but it bespoke the fact that I had to assume that Paul must have had a much less involved board at Wofford than he had here.
Well, I think thereafter, he always and until now contends that they were not satisfied with him, whatever happened.
Well, I think that's probably true.
He did resign, but it was kind of an ultimatum to him, and then that seemed to be true. And then he resigned, and then he was sorry that he resigned. But he always said it was because of football violations, and then that was the reason for it. It seemed to me that it was broader than that.
Oh, I think it was much broader than that. Following up on the athletic thing, after this happened, Hayden was removed as coach and AD, and without really much consultation with Paul, the leadership of the board brought in a businessman from in town, a former football player, alumnus, Dick Davis, came in as athletic director. Now, this was an important move because this was the first time that I think in the history of the university, but certainly the first time in many years that we had a separate athletic director separated from the head football coach. And he was essentially handed to Paul and said, "Here is your AD." And that was a difficult episode. But there were some other factors talking about where Paul may have stubbed his toe. I remember very clearly in the preparation of the first budget, which normally is finished in March, and because of the size and complexity of it, and with some new hands aboard like me, it didn't get done until June, and that was a problem for the board, and understandably so.
Well, it's almost as if he was a minor executive who was reviewed in his second year and found wanting and warned about what to do in the future, and he exploded.
Yeah.
But I do remember after he resigned and after he had visited with you, he came to a group of faculty and former presidents of the faculty senate and wanted to rescind the resignation and wanted the faculty to stand up for him. But it was a little late then to do anything about it. And then my colleague Tom Arp led that faculty senate.
He was president of the Senate then, I think.
Yeah, Tom was president of the faculty senate, and he led this relentless charge. What happened? You got to tell us what the reasons were. but they never did.
Yeah. I'm not sure that they really could point to a given reason. I think that it was a collection of things that just led to a vote of no confidence.
And I think your idea that if Bill Clements, who had to do with hiring Paul, had been there instead of Cox, it may be.
Yeah, because we need to point out, and many of the viewers will know this, that that fall, Nixon was reelected for a second term, and Cox was appointed as Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Clements
was appointed as Deputy Secretary of Defense, and that would have been 3 months into Paul's first academic year. And I think I've always felt that if Clements had stayed aboard, that it might not have altered the final outcome, but I think there's a chance that it could have, because I think Bill Clements would have worked pretty hard to try to salvage Paul. And there were a number of other pieces, and there was quite a bit going on at that time. You know, when was it? Sometime in the mid-'60s, after the master plan, one of the things that was called for was to re-energize and reshape the School of Engineering and the School of Business. And
that was called for in the master plan, right?
And
instead of doing away with them,
2 new deans were brought in to accomplish that. Tom Martin in engineering, and Tom, I think, must have come around 63, 64, 65. Do you remember?
No, I really don't. That should be about right.
And Jack Grayson came in business a couple of years after. And you will remember, because you and I were both involved in this, that at the time of the Southern Association self-study and subsequent reaccreditation visit, which was, 68, 69?
Yes, 68.
One of the things that...
Or 66, 67, I think.
I think the visitation was either 67 or 68.
Yeah, right.
When the visiting committee came.
Yeah, because Bill Stallcup and I were working on that report.
That's right.
Together.
Well, you remember that Larry Chalmers who was then the president of Florida State, I think, was the head of the visiting committee.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember the preface he wrote to the visiting committee's report? The statement that the Mustang was an appropriate mascot for the university because it resembled the runaway deans resembled a herd of Mustangs thundering across the plain. And that came to be important because one of the things that after I was appointed provost, and before Bill Clements left for Washington, he said to Hardin and me was he wanted us to rein in those runaway deans. And of course, he had been a part of setting it up so they could be runaway.
Absolutely, that was what happened after the master plan. He set up those strong deans.
That's right.
When we didn't get central help from the Ford Foundation.
Right.
So they out on their own scouting up donors and having foundations, and not just those 2 deans, but all those deans.
That's right.
All those deans.
All of them. Kermit Hunter in the arts.
On the go, yeah. Yeah.
That set off Kermit's. Kermit had a penchant for typing all of his own correspondence and writing just absolutely outrageous memoranda, which he'd fire off, and it was a catharsis for him and set off pandemonium around the campus. And I remember getting one from Kermit, and this was a little bit later, and I don't remember even who the target dean was, but Dean so-and-so is a thief and a villain. He's poaching on my development preserves here, and sent copies to everybody from the president on to all the other deans, and I don't know how many other people. And Kermit didn't realize that he had kind of caused a problem, but he certainly did. In any event, back to School of Engineering, Paul's and my efforts to, quote, rein in, which really we weren't trying to rein in, we were trying to use those schools as ways to begin to rebuild other pieces of the university. But it was interpreted as reining in, and Tom Martin became really pretty agitated, and there was a very difficult meeting that clearly made its mark on me. Tom Martin and Mark Shepard, who was then the chairman of, chairman of Texas Instruments, and he was chairman of the engineering committee of the board, and Ed Cox and Paul and me. And it was a very brutal confrontation about how we were incompetent and were maladministering things in the university and undoing all the good work in engineering and so on. And that's important. I mention that only because I think that's another piece of Paul's problems. It was a difficult time for him.
Well, did you feel that you, as provost, had authority over all the schools?
Not when I became provost. I felt I had to acquire authority as quickly as I could, and I was trying to do it in a way that was not destructive. And that one of the great things about Paul was that he backed his provost and his vice presidents as long as he was convinced that you were proceeding responsibly. You got 110% backing. It was great. And that was part of the problem. We were beginning to, try to reshape things. But there was another thing, and this doesn't have thing directly to do with Paul's difficulties, but that was a time when things were happening at Fort Burgwin too, and you know a lot about that. Clements had given this gift to build 10 residential casitas and a dining hall.
Well, Fort Burgwin, sitting about 10 miles out of Taos in the Carson Forest, 400 or 500 acres. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I remember when you and I first went out there together to the D.H. Lawrence Festival.
1970.
Yeah. Robert Bly was blasting off, and they were all, it was a wonderful, wild time. You asked me if our humanist conferences were always like that.
Yes, I did.
No, I think so. But I came to love that place, and you did too, and supported programs out there. I think I was the first one out there besides the archaeologists, anthropologists, and I had a creative writing workshop.
You did for a number of years.
Yeah, and you fully supported that, and that was a wonderful time. I was also on the board. And the board was composed of Taos people and a few university people.
Right.
You and I, and the purpose of the board was to bring Fort Burgwin to SMU, and SMU would have to improve the place and be responsible about it. And it would take how many years before that? 19 years or something?
The Fort Burgwin board, as it was originally constituted for Fort Burgwin as an independent research entity, when they signed the agreement with the university, which I believe was 1964, they specified that there was this probationary period in which the university had each year to put in, I think it was $10,000, a figure in that order, to improve and support the place. And of course the Clements gift of the casitas and so on did a great deal to cement that. But the critical date was 1979, when if the university had fulfilled its obligations throughout the intervening 15 years, then the title would pass from the Fort Burgwin board as an independent corporation, free and clear to the university at that point. And then there was another 10-year period that was sort of a reversionary period if anything went wrong after that. It was a 25-year plan that they'd put in place.
But that was fun, and it was an amazing resource. And the university keeps trying to figure out exactly what to do with it. And it went into a phase of general education and specialized courses. And I remember being out there with Bill Clements, who loved that place and built a house
and does.
there. Yeah, built a house there. Remember, we huddled with Bill. You and I huddled with Bill Clements, and he said, "I think it's a three-legged stool."
Yeah.
And I'm not quite clear what the three legs were, but
well, he certainly had the vision. I think the three legs were the Taos and the university and the public leg, and but he was enormously supportive. And one of the last things he did before he went to Washington was to fly out there and stake out the casitas and the dining hall with Fred Wendorf, and I was on that trip with them. And I'm sure other people had thought about this, but one thing that really came home to me was what an enormous impact, and you alluded to this, the improvement of facilities was, because it all of a sudden moved us from being a field school, essentially a field school for archaeology and geology. Mm-hmm. And your first few years in the writing program, you were camping out along with those field schools.
Absolutely,
in the old sawmill buildings.
Yeah. Nine women students at the top of the chalet, which was the dining hall.
Right.
Yeah. Really packed in. But wonderful. Tito Archuleta was the caretaker, and his wife Florida, and they took good care of the place. But he would hear the typewriters out in the woods, get his rifle and go see what was going on.
Yeah. Because you didn't have rooms for studies, each student, as I recall, had to go find a comfortable little spot under a tree or in a tree.
That's right. My office was by the river, with just an old table. That's the ruins of which are still there. But those are wonderful times, and great students, and then the program got more formal.
And we started doing, by this time, the nature of man and all of that university college stuff had come along, and we were offering some of those courses out there, along with a bunch of arts courses.
We were. And then it settled into a pattern which it still has, and it's still being developed. Right now, there's the new information center and library being built. Another significant gift. But it was clear that the kind of arts, including writing and music and photography and so on, and painting, that would be inspired by being in that place, plus biology and anthropology and geology, which were in those zones there. That's what should be done there.
And I think that one of the things that is still a problem, I think, is having a faculty that is not necessarily a permanent faculty out there, but a continuing faculty. And one of the things we tried to do, Bill Stalkup and I, during the 70s, was to create a position, a faculty position in geology and biology and archaeology primarily, rather than other phases of anthropology, with the understanding that that faculty member would teach out there every summer. And that would count as one semester, and then teach in Dallas, on the Dallas campus, for one of the other 2 semesters. And the third, either the fall or the spring, would be the equivalent of a summer break for those faculty.
Well, Jim, you know, it was just a central part of my life for a while, and wrote parts of 2 books out there. I knew John Nichols. John showed up with Doug Terry, one of our students, who went on to publish a book called The Last Texas Hero,
Right.
about SMU football. Doug was a good writer. This lanky guy came in, and John Nichols said he would like to read to the workshop. I said, great. He read some early chapters of the Milagro Beanfield War.
Which later made into a movie.
Yeah. And John's still a friend. Of course, John was the bête noir of the Taos establishment people, because he would satirize them in some of the books. And so we had that friendship on one side, and then Tony and I and you and Ellie were friends with some of the people on the board, and genuine friends.
Absolutely.
And they were so welcoming. Jack Brandenburg, who was the central figure, and his wife, who was Dorothy, who was the daughter of Burninghouse, one of the original
Burninghouse, right.
Taos artists, and she regaled us with these wonderful stories of many things, including D.H. Lawrence being there. So the whole lore and mythology of Taos was ours, but some of the people on the board were very close friends.
That's right.
So we had that, not just, we weren't just proving that Texans weren't bad people in New Mexico, but we built a genuine relationship. And
we did.
There.
And another person we ought to mention in that context is Paul Sears.
Oh, yes.
Paul was a dear person. He was a very distinguished scientist. Had been president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I think was one of the original people in the National Science Foundation. He had founded the ecology program at Yale University, having come there from Oberlin. But Paul was a delightful person and enormously supportive, and gave real scientific credence to what was going on out there.
And he was in his 90s.
He was in his 90s, exactly. And
we would be there in the evening, and he would say, "And what would you like to drink?"
That's right.
He'd say, "A martini," because we knew he loved martinis. He said, "The devil you say."
That's right.
Produce a martini. I went with him one evening when some of his violin students, he taught violin.
Yeah.
Among many other things he did.
That's right.
And this fellow came out on the stage, said, "Our first number one," and Paul said, "Enunciate." This kid.
Yeah, he was. Paul was a delight, but he and Jack Brandenburg, probably more than any other 2 people. Jack had been chairman of the board intermittently, but in the latter years was the ongoing chairman. They're the ones that, and Fred Wendorf in his just completed history of Fort Burgwin during the early years alludes to the fact that he had gotten crosswise with Marion Myers, the longtime resident out there, and a close friend of Ralph Rounds, the original donor of Fort Burgwin land. And Marion was not very happy about the idea of SMU taking over the fort. She had other ideas in mind for it. And certainly you were involved in a number of these was a lot of effort put in by you and me and one or two other people to rescue that from an alternate future that she had in mind. And the Brandenburgs and Sears of the world were awfully important in that rescue operation, because they recognized the importance of being affiliated with a university as opposed to a commercial enterprise.
Yeah. Well, we're still looking for the wonderful thing would be to have an endowment and support creative writers.
I couldn't agree more. Well, you know, you deserve a lot of credit, because you did do the first non-scientific program out there, and it kind of broke the ice and brought other people, made other people feel comfortable in coming out there. And one of the things that I think, this was during the period when Gene Bonelli was Dean of the Art School, and this would have been a little bit later in the 80s. There was a wonderful summer music program, a very multifaceted program out there, and that was I think a real contribution that the university could make to that community. So there were many other things that happened during the Hardin years, but one that I particularly want to touch on, because I think it also played into what happened with Paul, has to do with the Southwest Legal Foundation. And you will remember, and this goes really back to the period just after World War II, when Robert Story came back as Dean of the School of Law and organized the Southwest Legal Foundation as a continuing education component, companion to the formal legal education. And he retired by the 60s and was succeeded by a man named Andrew Cecil. In the meantime, Charlie Galvin had become Dean of the School of Law with 2 or 3 intervening deans. And unfortunately, I think Andrew Cecil was a difficult person to deal with, and there were problems about the allocation of space and when things were scheduled and so forth and so on. And in Paul Hardin's first year, Charlie Galvin came to see him and said, "Mr. President, we just have to give the Legal Foundation an ultimatum. Either they adhere to our needs or they need to leave." And Paul, being the assertive young president that he was, went to the board of the Legal Foundation and said it just about that way, that they needed to shape up or ship out. And that board had on it, among other people, J. Eric Johnson.
Yeah.
And one didn't exactly deliver ultimata to Eric Johnson.
I think there was this is just theory, but I think there was deep strain in Paul. And I love Paul, and I think this was a very bad break for the university.
I do too.
Because I think he would have been eventually a great president, and just exactly the right kind of a president. And this was the first. Willis had been president for 20 years. Selectman had been president for 20 years, and you don't particularly want that to go on, but the kind of breaks that we then had, following Hardin, were anticipated in this. And I think that Paul thought he was doing better than he was doing.
I think Paul misread the situation seriously, partly born out of the self-confidence that he couldn't fail, and it was terribly unfortunate, because I agree with you. I'm personally very fond of Paul, and I think he had many fine academic qualities, very many fine personal qualities, and it's just unfortunate that he did not have a more realistic sense, had not been given a more realistic sense of what he was getting into here. And I think he could have handled it if he had realized it.
And it has to do a great deal with Dallas and the way Dallas was run by
Exactly.
an oligarchy, and part of which were bosses in regard to SMU.
Exactly, or tried to be.
Yeah. So there always, and is less now, I think, since we have established a successful campaign finally.
Right.
And since Ken Pye came in and helped straighten things out, there's more authority in the president's office. But that was not true with Paul. And although Jim Zumberge, I think, was a very good president, he did leave.
He did leave.
And we went on from there. Shields was very much under the thumb of.
No question about, in my mind, about that.
So this is a tough thing, and we had, as we said about the master plan, it did good things, but it also created that board of governors.
Yeah.
Trustees and non-trustees, who were a small group, and they pretty much ran things and tried to run them directly. So there was always what was going on in the university, and then what was going on behind the scenes. And Paul didn't look and see that much was going on behind the scenes.
That's right. He, and I think the fact that he came in thinking about focusing his energy on the campus to the exclusion, almost to the exclusion of the town and the board, that meant that he was not able to pick up some of the vibes that he might otherwise have become aware of that would have tipped him off that he needed to change directions or at least modify directions. That was unquestionably that was the case in my thinking. It was people look for a simple reason why Paul left, and I don't think there is a simple reason. I think it was as you said a while ago, a collection of things that added up to a vote of no confidence by the then leadership of the board, some of whom I think were probably not as enthusiastic about Paul when he was hired as Bill Clements was.
Well, his father was a bishop. I mean, he really must have thought he had his flank guarded, and that was very important. He was Methodist, and Zumberge came along, and I don't know that he was of any religious affiliation.
Well, he was a Congregationalist when he came and joined the Methodist Church after he got here, but he wasn't.
Was he the one who joined on the phone?
I think so.
And then they ask about Shields. Is he a man of faith? And Ed Cox, I remember saying, every sense of the word, in every sense of the word. Yes, indeed.
That's right. Well, one of the things that happened, and just mention it briefly because I think it was important recognition for the university, Jack Grayson had come as Dean of the School of Business, and during Paul's term, he was appointed price commissioner by the Nixon administration.
Yes.
Because at that time we were dealing with runaway price inflation and that sort of thing. And so he left, and Bobby Lyle became executive dean of the school and really effectively ran it for 2 years after Grayson left, and really even when he came back and before Alan Coleman was appointed. So he didn't have the difficulties that Tom Martin had, and Tom in the meantime had in the spring of '74, Paul's last year, Tom was offered the presidency of the Illinois Institute of Technology and resigned, moved there in May at the completion of the spring term here as president. And that very probably would have come along anyway, irrespective of any tensions he felt with Paul and me.
And you can say these things were setbacks, but really, if you have a sense of the development of a university, they also opened up some new ideas and structures. I think Martin inherited a rather old-timey faculty.
Yeah.
And tried to improve it. He restructured things. He had grids put on top of departments, and Grayson did the same thing.
Exactly.
In business, he did the same thing. He imposed a superstructure on the old structure, and I think it was very hard for some of those people who were old-time faculty members in each of those schools to get their bearings, and Grayson's experiment was not successful.
That's right. Whereas Martin's was fairly successful.
Yes. Grayson's was not successful because it went to the extreme characteristic of the 70s that the students should choose what they wanted to learn.
Right.
And form their own curriculum.
That's right.
Which seems a bit strange, because how would they know in the first place and we also, it was going against the grain of the university, which all the way along was requiring general education courses and saying this is what all the students should have.
And there were efforts to circumvent that by the leadership of the business school.
Absolutely. And so that's another ongoing struggle. But Alan Coleman, you mentioned, was a great humanist.
He really was.
And a book collector and a
art collector
and a wise and sophisticated person. We were very glad to see him because he firmly believed in the liberal arts as the basis of the business.
Right, being
leaders,
a Stanford product and
education, and that was, as old man Thornton used to say, a happy day when Alan Coleman came, I think.
Yeah, actually, it was kind of interesting because Grayson, in the latter part of the Tate interregnum that followed Paul's departure, Grayson returned, and he'd sort of expressed the desire when Bobby Lyle wanted to go away and do a doctorate. Grayson had said, well, he thought he ought to resign too, and I persuaded him to stay on because we just had the Paul Hardin termination, and we didn't need any more unrest, and Lyle was going, and Grayson very graciously agreed to stay on. And then after Jim Zumberge was here, came in, and I think one of the first major things that happened in Jim's tenure was that Grayson came in and resigned. And so that was an interesting transition and a very good one from my point of view. We have just a few minutes left. Willis came back in after the Hardin resignation, and he came back to, of course, to a great deal of faculty unrest. And you had a good deal. You were in a faculty leadership position at that time, and that was a difficult time.
Yes, it was. So difficult that I went to Spain.
And, one of the things that it seemed to me important to do, and Willis agreed, was to begin to look to the future and think about institutional planning. And even though Willis had been just down the hall, he never moved out of the southeast corner of Perkins Administration Building. Paul was in the northeast corner. But Willis was really, to his credit, had disengaged pretty thoroughly, and he did not know where things were administratively. And from my point of view, that was a difficult time because he was the de facto president, but I was the one who knew what was happening and where things were going. And it was a real compliment to Willis that he was very gracious and graceful about the way he handled that. And he and I, we'd always had a cordial relationship, but we really developed a very close relationship during that time, and one that I cherished afterwards, because up till the time of his death, after that, and after I left administration particularly, he'd call up about once a month and say, let's have lunch, and we'd solve all the university's problems and deal with all the shortcomings of our successors.
Well, but Jim, you were crucial then. The university owes you a great debt for many things, but that's one of them. And it was your steadiness through these years that kept the ship afloat.
Well,
Willis was off kilter. I remember when he took over. He was like the old tackle. He came off the bench.
That's right.
He didn't quite know what to do, you know.
That's right.
And he had gracefully tried to merge back into a chancellorship and not be this great eagle over the young hawk. And
that's right.
He was gracious, but that was a strange time. Then Zumberge came in after some other adventures, trying to find a president.
That's right, and there was a search committee chaired by Bob Cullum, and with Johnny Marie Grimes' hand firmly on the tiller behind Bob, and there were three people that were serious candidates, and I know this because they all wanted to talk with me. One was Frank Rhodes, who was then Dean of Arts and Sciences at Michigan, subsequently went on to become president of Cornell for about 20 years, very successful president at Cornell. And a chap named Singletary, who was the president of the University of Kentucky.
I remember him and his visit, yes.
And then finally Jim Zumberge came. And Jim was here for 5 years, and you said it, and I couldn't agree more. Jim was a very solid academic, and I think a very effective president.
He wore the leather jacket just like Hardin had. I don't know what that had to do about that. I remember I went to really meet him, and I'd kind of grown up in the president's office.
Sure.
And I went in, and he got up. He had this desk, and he had this Antarctic flag on it,
that's right.
An American flag at the other end. And he was a cool, if not cold, customer. And he went behind his desk, had on a vest, and put on his coat, buttoned his coat, looked at me and said, "What can I do for you?" And I said nothing and left. But we got to be friends later on.
Well, Jim really said to me once, "I can't let anybody get too close to me. It's too hard to make hard decisions." And that was, unfortunately, the one thing that made it difficult to work with Jim. He didn't want to be on easy terms with anybody, particularly the people who were close to him.
Well, that famous word that he spoke at his first, when he addressed the faculty, and he said, "I'm not engaging in hyperbole when I say that SMU can be a fine," and we thought, hyperbole? Is this some kind of a new bowl we're going to play in, And then afterwards, Bonnie Wheeler said, "President Zumberge, don't you mean hyperbole?" And he said, "No, it's hyperbole."
Yes, I remember.
And she said, "Well, sometimes we see a word and we can't pronounce it when we're growing up, like epitome, looks funny on the page." He said, "No, it's hyperbole." And damned if when Shields came and addressed the faculty for the first time, he said, "SMU is going to be the epitome of the private university." We thought, what's happening to us?
Oh, that's very true.
I told that to Ken Pye later. He said, "That's not funny. Don't make fun of presidents."
Well, I guess we're winding down. A number of important things happened in the Zumberge years, and
well, one of the most important was sticking to the academic philosophy of the master plan.
That's right.
Revising the the general education curriculum.
Yep.
And John Deschner and I were on that committee.
Well, it was the Terry Commission, called the Terry Commission, you and John Deschner and Tom Williams and
Julius Aronofsky and Ann Thomas
Ann
and
Thomas.
Lloyd Fouch.
right.
It was a wonderful
It was a
year
very
long,
strong committee.
and we were very philosophical.
Yeah.
And we said it have to stay true to the